back, loves. Today, I will be finishing my dear Slendy, part of my Creepypasta collection. He was supposed to be done for Halloween, but life was so busy that I wasn't even home all month to work on him. So, it's a late finale. Last Halloween, my patient was Laughing Jack, who ended up getting adopted and finding a great home. I plan to, in the future, redo my Jeff the Killer, without him being tied to some collab, to make him more horrible looking like he's supposed to be. This theme is Slenderman. Now I will stop talking and Azra will take over.
The Slenderman first came to life via a Photoshop challenge thread posted on the Something Awful forums back in 2009, roughly the Stone Age in terms of internet time. The creative thread challenged users to edit normal, everyday photos to give them a supernatural spin. There were many entries, but one in particular stuck and immediately captured the forum's imagination. Eric Knudsen, posting under his account name of Victor Spurge, doctored a couple of black and white photos, adding a thin, distorted, unnaturally tall, pale figure into the background, indistinct of facial features and wearing a black suit. The first sighting of Slenderman had occurred. It's hard to pin down exactly why the creature resonated so much harder than any of the thread's other entries. Perhaps it was the fabricated historical quotations Knudsen added to the photos, which expertly combine conversational, mundane trappings with enigmatic abstraction and profoundly unsettling, unsaid details in the tradition of much of the best literary horror. One of two recovered photographs from the Sterling City Library blaze, notable for being taken the day 14 children vanished and for what is referred to as the Slender Man. Deformities cited as film defects by officials. A fire at the library occurred 1 week later. The actual photograph was confiscated as evidence. 1986. Photographer Mary Thomas, missing since June 13th, 1986. We didn't want to go, we didn't want to kill them, but its persistent silence and outstretched arms horrified and comforted us at the same time. 1983. Photographer unknown, presumed dead. Or perhaps it was the stark imagery itself. There's a primal simplicity to the impact the Slender Man has. He's deeply wrong to behold, but only just. He's depicted with a familiar shape and familiar iconography, but he's ever so slightly off in a way that makes him incredibly unsettling. By appearing as a broken, just glimpsed reflection of humanity, he's more disturbing than any number of giant fanged winged demons could ever hope to be. But whatever the reasons for his intuitive, collective adoption, the Slender Man was here to stay. I don't use the term lightly when I say that he came to life in that thread. Very quickly, the character was picked up by many SA users, swiftly developed, riffed on, expanded, and mythologized in ways far beyond the material included in Knudsen's original post. The abstract narrative hints in the photo captions were spun to create new facets of the character, his ability, and his intent. Slightly different visual interpretations spun and stretched organically. Sometimes he had grotesquely long limbs. Sometimes he had tentacles. Sometimes he had no face. Sometimes his face changed depending on the personality and fears of those who beheld him. The most powerful side effect of this rapid, crowdsourced evolution was that rather than diluting the character, these many subtly different interpretations solidified his myth. and added power to it. By evolving and changing the Slenderman while continuing to build him via suitable variations on the original theme and largely keeping the exact details of his nature ambiguous and unknowable, this swift extrapolation strengthened and consolidated the sense of the Slenderman as a folklore entity. The concept of folklore is key to the whole thing. While the creature's collaborative evolution followed the same model as an internet meme, with all the incremental adaptation, consolidation, and re-adaptation that makes any repeated online joke a living, changing entity. It also tapped into something more powerful. The evolution of the Slenderman wasn't the usual internet process of flogging a joke from multiple angles until every last avenue of humor is expended. It was the process of growing a character, story, and mythology through collective imagination, the shared fears, ideas, and narrative understanding of a vast group coming together via endless inter-inspiration to create something ultimately tangible. Although a brand new character, the creation and evolution of the Slenderman was an act of genuine folklore in accelerated form. Everyone involved might have been entirely aware that that character was fabricated, but how their alternative takes, tales, and distortions added to his legend perfectly parallel the creation of any number of more real monsters throughout the ages, built by long-term hearsay and mythical word-of-mouth exaggeration. The process was the same. The internet just allowed it to happen much, much faster. And so Slenderman was suddenly as close to a legitimate part of the folklore pantheon as a modern, artificially engineered creature could be. There remained in his nature a deeply unusual element, in that where older monsters without a clear point of origin are defined in their realness by exactly that otherness, that sense that they exist and always have outside of the bounds of human civilization. The Slenderman came with a sense of ownership. For all of his terrifying countenance and mythology, there was also a strange, slightly warm attachment. The nightmare he might be, but he was also our nightmare. This didn't harm him, mind. In fact, it only made him spread faster. Now existing far beyond something awful, the Slenderman rapidly became the star of fan art, fiction, video games, short films, and even an early first movie, which got a limited cinema release following its online launch in 2015. Knudsen remains the official creator of the character, with a still unknown third party taking possession of the licensing rights. But the monster felt free to turn up anywhere. But eventually, somewhere along the line, that freedom and ubiquity seemed to lead to his taking a step further away from his origins. Knudsen once stated, when discussing Slenderman's validity as a genuine urban myth, that an urban legend requires an audience ignorant of the origin of the legend. It needs unverifiable third and fourth hand, or more, accounts to perpetuate the myth. Eventually, despite the creature's nature being entirely understood by the more engaged part of its audience, in some areas he managed to cut the cord and break free. And here's where the story takes a far realer, darker turn. It, perhaps unsurprisingly, wasn't long before the mainstream press started losing track of Slenderman's background. In just 2011, the Minneapolis Star-Tribune described the monster's origins as difficult to pinpoint, apparently believing the something awful threat to be merely the breakout moment for a pre-existing creature. But alas, the disconnect didn't stop there. In May 2014, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Wire conspired to kill their friend Peyton Leutner in the Wisconsin woods. Leutner was stabbed 19 times, but miraculously survived. All three girls were just 12 years old at the time of the incident. The perpetrators claimed that carrying out the murder was intended as a ritualistic step in becoming proxies, a kind of thrall in some versions of the mythology, to the Slenderman. They also said that they feared the monster would harm their families if they did not carry out the act, and wanted to prove to doubters that he was real. Now, of course, the story of the Slenderman is not responsible for this tragedy. Geyser and Wire were deeply troubled, in addition to being naive to the Slenderman's origins, and have recently both, now 15 years old, been committed to mental health facilities following guilty pleas after a long debate over the correctness of trying them as either children or adults. These events were truly awful, but as is so often the case with such events, arguably the product of troubled minds seeking out and adopting dark media to work into their existing outlook, rather than being directly influenced by it. No one involved in creating the Slenderman mythology was responsible for their deeds. The Silent Watcher. The rain had been falling for hours, a relentless, steady pour that filled the streets with a dull, monotonous sound. In the small town of Hawthorne, nestled on the edge of a dense, whispering forest, the storm felt like more than just weather. It felt like something was stirring, something that was not of the earth, something ancient and patient. Ellen Myers hadn't been back to Hawthorne in over a decade. She'd left for college, then moved to the city, and slowly lost touch with the place where she'd grown up. But when her father fell ill, there was no choice but to return. The house she had left behind was still standing, though it seemed to carry the weight of years in the peeling paint and cracked windows. Her father, once a man full of life and stories, now lay silent in his bed, his voice a faint echo of what it used to be. He had been sick for months, a sickness no one could diagnose, but Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something darker had caused his decline. She had been staying at the house for 3 days now, tending to him, trying to sort through old memories. The house was eerily quiet, the silence amplified by the pounding rain outside. She had been warned by some of the older residents of Hawthorne about the curse of the forest, a superstition passed down through generations. As a child, Ellen had always dismissed it, chalking it up to the usual small-town folklore. But now, in the stillness of the house, it was hard to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping in at the edges of her thoughts. On her 4th night back, Ellen decided to go for a walk. The storm had subsided to a soft drizzle, and the streets of Hawthorne were empty, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the last person on earth. She slipped on her coat, grabbed an umbrella, and stepped out into the night. The streets were bathed in the glow of old street lamps, their light flickering in the mist. She didn't really have a destination in mind, but her feet led her toward the woods that bordered the town. The path, overgrown with weeds and crumbling with age, stretched out before her like a dark artery, pulling her in. She didn't think much of it at first, just an old habit of wondering that she hadn't outgrown. But as she walked deeper into the woods, something began to feel off. The air was colder now, and the trees around her stood taller than they had when she was a child. They seemed to close in on her, their branches reaching down like long, gnarled fingers. She pulled her coat tighter around her, feeling suddenly vulnerable. The path was narrow and winding, and with each step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just the forest, she told herself. It always felt oppressive at night. But then, as she turned a corner, she froze. There, standing just beyond the edge of the path, was a figure. At first, she thought it might be a trick of the light. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure became clearer. Tall. Too tall. The shadows around it seemed to bend and distort unnaturally, as though the very space around it was warping. The figure had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where a head should have been. Its body was unnaturally thin, dressed in a dark suit that billowed slightly in the damp air. Long, spindly arms hung at its sides, extending too far for any human proportions. A chill ran down her spine as she stared at the creature. It didn't move, didn't even seem to breathe. It simply stood there, watching her. She felt her heart pound in her chest, her legs frozen in place. The figure felt wrong, not just in its appearance, but in the way it existed, like it shouldn't be. The air felt thick, oppressive, and Ellen's mind raced. She remembered the stories from her childhood, the stories about a figure in the woods, a thing with no face, whose presence drove people to madness, whose tall, thin frame haunted the deepest shadows of the forest. They called it Slenderman. Her breath caught in her throat, and a primal fear took hold of her. Every part of her body screamed to turn around and run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its gaze fixed on her. And though it had no eyes, Ellen could feel its stare, cold and unblinking, piercing into her very soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. Ellen's legs finally gave way, and she stumbled back onto the path. Her heart was racing, her breath ragged as she turned and fled, not looking back, not caring if she tripped or fell. She had to get away. She didn't stop until she was safely back at the house, slamming the door behind her. The silence of the house seemed even louder now, pressing in on her, filling her ears with the deafening hum of her own pulse. She pressed her back against the door, trying to calm her breathing, but the image of the creature lingered in her mind, its tall, dark form forever imprinted on her thoughts. Her father had woken while she was out. He sat in his bed, his eyes wide and glassy. His lips moved, but no sound came out, only faint, unintelligible whispers. She rushed to his side, trying to soothe him, but as she looked into his eyes, she felt something shift in the room, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "Dad, what is it?" she whispered. "What's happening?" He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes filled with a strange, hollow terror. Then, with a shuddering breath, he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible, "He's here. He's been waiting for you." Ellen's blood ran cold. She had no idea what he meant. Her father had always been a practical man, never one to indulge in fantasy or superstition. But his fear was real, and it mirrored her own. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside, to the rain tapping against the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, she decided to leave. The town felt cursed now. The woods were too close, and her father's condition was worsening by the hour. She packed her things quickly, determined to put as much distance between herself and whatever had been lurking in those woods. But as she stepped outside, she saw it again. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the tree line, the figure stood. Its limbs hung loosely, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it was studying her. The space around it rippled, like reality itself was warping in its presence. She didn't look away. She couldn't. For a moment, everything seemed to slow down, and Ellen felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though she was being pulled into the forest itself, drawn by some unseen force. And then, without warning, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. Ellen didn't wait. She turned and ran, not caring where she went, only that she had to escape. The storm was gone, but the nightmare had only just begun. When she finally made it out of Hawthorne, she swore she'd never return. But deep down, she knew that the creature from the woods wasn't finished with her. It was still out there, watching, waiting. And it would always know where she was. Slenderman doesn't forget.
Well, thank you, Azra, for filling me in on the lore of Dear Slendyman. He has always been one of my childhood favorites. I hope you enjoyed and appreciate you staying to the end. If you enjoyed this session of art and scary stories, then like and subscribe, if you dare. Until we meet again, may your dreams be filled with the whispers of the forgotten and the echoes of the unseen.